Hi, I'm Tiffany Fennell, Chair of the Veterans Affairs section of Division 18, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar titled Veterans Programming in the Federal Bureau of Prisons, presented by Mr. Karl Leukefeld and Dr. Caron Heigel. And this webinar is sponsored by the VA section of APA Division 18, Psychologists in Public Service. So Division 18 is considered the home division for VA psychologists in APA, as well as for other public service psychologists like those in the Federal Bureau of Prisons, community state hospitals, Indian Country, and police and public safety. For more information about Division 18 and the Veterans Affairs section, you can check out the files and the web links pods here in the webinar room for a brochure and links to our website, Twitter, and Facebook page. And you'll also find a copy of today's slides in the files pod that you can download for reference. All questions can be entered into the chat box, and the presenters will respond to questions as we go, and there'll be some time also left towards the end to answer questions. And if you experience any technical issues, just let me know in the chat box and I'll attend to you as quickly as I can. So now on to speaker introductions. So Mr. Karl Leukefeld is a Disabilities Program Manager in the Women and Special Populations Branch for the Federal Bureau of Prisons. He's worked for the Bureau of Prisons for over 17 years and has a background in institutional treatment programs, case management, residential reentry, community treatment services, juvenile services, and working with the Bureau's special populations to include the veteran population. And our second presenter, Dr. Caron Heigel, has worked in the Federal Bureau of Prisons for the past decade. She's currently a competency assessment psychologist for the Federal Bureau of Prisons Central Office. And in this role, she designs and provides training to psychologists in the Bureau of Prisons and assists with workforce issues such as leadership development, staffing, and recruitment. So I'm very pleased these speakers are available to help inform us today about veterans programming. And I'll turn it now over to our speakers.
Thanks, Tiffany, and thanks to all of you for kind of joining us today. What we're going to do is we'll talk a little bit about the Bureau of Prisons in general, and then we'll talk about the veterans programming that we have in the Bureau right now. And then Dr. Heigel will talk a little bit about psychology services and the services that we offer for not only veterans, but other inmates in our population. So, getting started. And I just kind of talked a little bit about this. So the objectives that we have is we'll look at the Bureau of Prisons and the veterans population and the demographics that we have in our custody. And then we'll also look at the programming opportunities for veterans. One of the things that we want to discuss is the Bureau recognizes that veterans have kind of a host of specialized needs, and those needs are not only physical and mental health issues, but they also can stem from specific uniform service. So when we look at that, we understand, kind of looking at our population and then some of the state correctional systems, veterans often, when they're incarcerated, kind of have feelings of isolation from their peers who haven't experienced uniform service. So when we recognized that, one of the goals that we had was to develop programming that would target military service and uniform service, and then kind of use that in a holistic approach that the Bureau has adopted to make sure that the reentry needs are being met and that their needs while they're incarcerated are met. And those needs may or may not stem from their uniform service, but we want to make sure that uniform service is addressed kind of, again, holistically with the other needs that the inmates have. So before we talk specifically about veterans, I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of an overview of the Bureau of Prisons. And if I start to use weird acronyms or vernacular government speak, Tiffany, just weigh in and knock me on the head and tell me quit doing that and actually talk so we can understand you. But the Bureau of Prisons right now, we have 122 facilities, and we have in those facilities there's five security levels. And in the five security levels, we start at the bottom, which is minimum, and then we have low, medium, high, and maximum. So to give you some idea, A minimum security inmate is going to be what you hear of in the news, and they call it a camper. And a camp is a place that inmates will go and they have under 10 years to serve on their sentence. They're not secure. They have open dorms, open bays. There's no fence. There's no towers. There's no perimeter patrols or anything like that. So those are deemed to be the minimum security inmates, or the kind of the lowest risk that we have to escape from an institution. So they're there. When we move up in security levels, the next one is low, and a low security institution. Uh, let's see, if you look at the pictures there, actually, I can show you a picture of one. On the right middle is FCI Morgantown, is a low security facility. A low security facility is going to have a fence around it, but it may or may not have cells. It still has open bays. It doesn't have gun towers, but has mobile perimeter trucks for security that will go around it. Medium security institution is the next as we move up. A medium security institution will have fences, it will have mobile perimeters, and the inmates will have cells that they're housed in. They're not in open bays. High security would be a United States penitentiary. A United States penitentiary has towers on it for security, as well as mobile perimeters. So your high security or penitentiary is, unless you have special needs, going to be the highest security that we have, or we hold inmates in. And then the last that we have is maximum, and maximum would be the administrative detention unit in Florence, Colorado. And you may have seen that in the news. It's called Alcatraz of the Rockies, kind of in popular culture. We refer to it as the ADX. So that's kind of an overview of institutions, probably more than you wanted to know. But our inmate population, as we kind of look at a snapshot of that, as you can see, as of September 1st, there's 177,326 inmates total, and that's not just in our 122 institutions. That also includes privately managed facilities, and those are facilities that we contract with to hold inmates. Usually those are going to be inmates with lesser health and mental health needs would be there. A lot of them are immigrations and customs enforcement detainers, have detainers on them, and they will be deported once they finish their sentences. We also have, you'll see kind of down at the bottom, it says that there's 10,646 in other types of facilities. We also contract out with jails, local jails like sheriffs, county jails, things like that. And we have halfway houses. And the halfway houses, or they're also referred to as residential reentry centers, are usually in inmates. They can have up to a year in a halfway house, but usually it's within the last 6 months of their sentence. They can be housed there in the community. So as we kind of move along, it's kind of a snapshot of the employees that the Bureau has. As you can see, we've at this point got right at a little under 36,000 employees, primarily male, some female that we have. And of our employees, 29% of them are eligible and claim veteran status. So that's interesting because, as we'll talk about in a little bit, that's a much higher representation than we have in our inmate population when we look at the veterans. So before we talk about veteran-specific programming too, let's talk a little about what an institution looks like and kind of the dynamics that are there. We talked a little bit about the security levels. And we talked about that minimums and low security facilities are open, have open bays. Medium securities have cells. One of the things that needs to be understood is primarily in our institutions, 90% of them, and most of the time, unless there's an incident, more than that, maybe even above 95% of them, the inmates are, there's open movement in the institutions. The inmates are not kept in cells. I know that that's kind of something that people see on TV or in the movies, and they say, oh, well, the inmates are kept in their cells for 23 hours a day and they're not let out. That's not the case at all. Most of them are moving. They're going to treatment. They're going to education. They're going to the commissary to buy things. They're going to the dining hall to eat. They're going to recreation. So we run open facilities as much as we can, again, unless there's an emergency. That means we do need to take more control and keep inmates in their cells. So when you look at an institution, kind of the easiest way to look at it, to kind of get your baseline as to how we operate, is a prison is a city behind a fence or behind a wall. And the easiest way to look at it is the Bureau is paramilitary, and outside of the institutions, we have a central office here in Washington, D.C., and that's where Caron and I work. And kind of our job is policy and training and keeping up with the Bureau's mission and any legislation that's going on to make sure that the policies are in line with that and interacting with other agencies. Under that, we have 6 regional offices. The regional offices have more direct oversight of the institutions kind of on a day-to-day basis, and they're the kind of the leadership of the institutions on the next level. And then we have the institutions or the contract sites. And when we look at an institution, again, like I said before, the best way to look at it is like a city behind a wall. So if you go with the city analogy, your warden is going to be like the mayor of the institution or of the city. And then we have what are called associate wardens, and your associate wardens are going to be over programs, operations, and then industries and education. And so operations is going to kind of be your day in, day out, the facilities, the physical plant, things like that. And then programs will be psychology services, unit management, and kind of direct services that are delivered to the inmates, health services, and things like that. So let's keep going with I'll try to get through this quicker. Is kind of the layout of the institution as a city. So you have your custody staff. The Bureau of Prisons does not have guards. We have correctional officers, and the difference between a guard and a correctional officer is a correctional officer has the authority to make arrests, and so federal correctional officers are federal law enforcement officers as well, and they can also be armed with those arrest powers. So they're not guards; they're correctional officers. So in the institution, if you look at the correctional officers or the custody staff as the police of the institution, that kind of is a good way to look at it. And we also have lock shops and armory, and they tend to kind of the physical plant needs with obviously the locks on the doors and anything that needs to come out of the armory. We also have lieutenants and captains and correctional officers. So that's kind of your police department in the institution. The other thing that we have that goes with custody is we have a special housing unit, which is, you can look at that as the jail in the institution. So if something happens and we need to take, again, kind of more control, there's a situation, we can use the special housing unit, again, as the jail in the institution. We also, if you kind of go down the list of an institution and as a city, we have food service. You can look at that as fine dining. It's where the inmates eat. It's also where the staff can eat. So if you look at it, there's an average of, in like a medium security facility, 1,200 inmates there. They're feeding all of those inmates 3 times a day. So it's kind of bigger than some of the biggest restaurants that most of us have probably ever been in. For the physical plants, you can look at the public works as we have facilities folks who are there. We also have a trust fund for the inmates, and the trust fund works to run the commissary. So you kind of look at that as the supermarket, and the inmates can buy food items. There's some clothing items that they can buy. They can buy watches, shoes, radios, things like that while they're there. And then if you kind of get down more to a day-to-day interaction with the inmates in the housing units, you have an officer who's on the unit, and so you can kind of look at the officers, the beat cop, for lack of a better term, who's there. And then each unit is staffed with a unit team, and the unit team is going to have a unit manager who, you can tell by the name, obviously manages the unit. There's also a case manager and a counselor. And the case manager is going to do the ins and outs. Every piece of paper that the inmate has in an institution or anything that happens goes through the case manager. They're not traditionally doing counseling on the units. It's kind of more of an administrative position, again, to get the inmates into the system, get them moved around the system, and then to help them with their release plans and making those and move them out. The counselor on the unit, that's kind of a deceptive title. They don't do actual counseling. They, again, kind of do administrative things. They make sure that the inmates' day-to-day needs are met, whether it's visiting, telephones, personal hygiene equipment, things that they need. The counselor take care of that. We also have education. Inmates can earn their GED. They can do correspondence courses. So that's kind of like the town school. We have religious services, which can be the town church if you want to look at it as a city. We also have in-house health services that can take care of the different physical health needs of the inmates. And then we have psychology services, which is staffed primarily with doctoral level psychologists. who meet the mental health needs and substance use and any other treatment, sex offender treatment needs, things like that in the institution. We also have a business office. If you want to look at that as city government, it's kind of the budgeting office. And then we have in-house human resources, computer resources. And kind of the other thing that we have in a number of our facilities is Unicor, which is prison industries. And you can kind of look at that as the town factory. It's kind of the industry that's there. So it's interesting because in an institution you have all of the staff who have these different backgrounds too, and they're interacting with the inmates. So it's really kind of an interesting dichotomy between the inmates and the staff and kind of the different backgrounds that everyone comes from and kind of maximizing those to work with the inmates. So let's talk a little bit about the Bureau of Prisons veterans population. So when we look at the veterans population, incarcerated veterans or veterans in the Bureau, the oversight is by the Women and Special Populations branch, and that's actually where I work. Veterans as a special population kind of came onto the scene or came to our attention about a year and a half, 2 years ago. The decision was made that veterans were a population that we could better serve, and so they fell under women and special populations. We also work kind of day to day with female offenders, inmates with disabilities, transgender inmates, juveniles, and inmates who are parents, so parenting programs for incarcerated folks. So it's interesting because when we in-house refer to veterans, we say that they're individuals who served in uniformed service, not the armed forces or military service, because not only do we consider a veteran to be someone who served in the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, the National Guard, or the Reserves, but we also look at the other two uniformed services, which a lot of folks kind of overlook. But it's United States Public Health Service and NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, because they are uniformed services. And it doesn't hurt that we also have a number of public health service staff who work in our institutions as well. So we want to make sure that we're serving everyone. So if an individual has served in any of these branches of the uniformed service, or in some cases dependents of veterans, we would consider them as eligible for Bureau of Prisons veteran services. So another thing that we need to look at too when we look at this is the Veterans Administration has clear criteria on who they would consider to provide services, and a lot of it is based on discharge. So we don't separate out discharge status for who will receive these benefits. For us to consider someone to be a veteran, they can be honorably discharged, dishonorably discharged, other than honorably discharged, or have a medical discharge to be eligible for services while incarcerated with us. It is, like I said before, important to recognize, and I'm sure you all do, that the VA does not have those criteria, and their services are dependent on the discharge status. So, for example, if we have a dishonorably discharged individual from the Air Force, they would be eligible for services in the Bureau, even though the VA may not give them services or provide services for them, or a military pension or benefits. We would. Because obviously, if they're in the criminal justice system, there's some behavioral issues. So there's a higher chance that we're going to have a larger and broader population we can serve if we include inmates who weren't just discharged honorably. So if we move on and we look a little bit more at the veterans population, the veterans population is at any given time about 10,500. As of yesterday when I looked, we have 10,278 total inmate veterans in our custody. So as you can see, we talked before, there's 177,000 inmates roughly in our custody at any one time. So it's well under 1%. And of those 10,278 currently, we only have 220 female offenders who are veterans. So those statistics are going to paint a pretty clear picture on the population that we're looking to serve. So the other thing to remember is we talked about there was about 29%, 29% at any one time of our staff are veterans in the institutions. We, however, do not give staff who are veterans preference for working with inmates. While that may help, all staff are encouraged to assist the veterans. So all of the staff, regardless of veteran preference themselves, while they may have specific insight on veterans culture and kind of interacting and dealing with prisoners and inmates, we also encourage all of our staff to have that interaction. We've provided several trainings for the staff bureau-wide in dealing with inmate and veterans needs. So the staff are going to be trained, and one of the things we've looked at, kind of veteran-specific issues, are looking at PTSD triggers, communication techniques, and services that we can provide. And institutions have some interesting challenges with veterans, especially when you look at PTSD. Um, when I started with the Bureau, I started at one of our medical centers in Lexington, Kentucky, and I worked with dual diagnosis inmates, and several of them were Vietnam vets, and they had PTSD. And I had one inmate on my caseload, and in October usually is when the Bureau of Prisons does its firearms qualification, and most institutions have a firing range. That institution, the windows were open, and it usually, because the weather was nice in Kentucky in October, and so one of the things that we dealt with several of these veterans were when the firing range was active, they would have active flashbacks while that was happening, and so it was dealing with that, and it was a really major trigger. Another trigger that we have is many of our institutions are in pretty rural areas, and a lot of the vets, not in my experience, the Desert Storm and Afghanistan veterans, but especially the Vietnam veterans, there were a lot of tree lines that were there that were triggers. Something else that in the institutions served as triggers were this closing of Sallyport doors. A couple of the veterans had said that it sounded like hatches closing when the grills and the doors would close on cells, which could trigger PTSD. So we've trained the staff to understand and recognize those and to kind of talk some of the veterans through that. Again, though, we are very lucky that we have a very active and robust psychology services department in the institutions. So we have licensed mental health professionals that are there to deal with and encourage and provide treatment for the inmates that are there in the institutions, and that is bureau-wide. Another population that we have is we have a small number of prisoners from the United States Disciplinary Barracks in Leavenworth, Kansas. We have an institution in Leavenworth, but that is not the disciplinary barracks. Leavenworth itself has about 8 or 9 institutions there. There's a bureau facility, there's the military barracks, there's several jails and private prisons that are there too. But right now we have about 260 military prisoners from the disciplinary barracks that are in our custody. So they also are eligible for any of the veterans programming or services. So kind of whittling down, we've gotten big, and we're going to go not hopefully down the rabbit hole, but down kind of the funnel. Is the Bureau uses a 3-tiered model for the delivery of services. And in developing that model, and we'll talk about each one of them a little bit more. Tier 1 is going to be at all institutions, and their general services is kind of basic information that's there, and it's eligible, again, to any of the veterans. Tier 2, as we kind of go kind of deeper into the weeds, you can look at those as outpatient services that are available in institutions, and we'll talk a little about what services are provided there. And then our third tier is a residential unit-based program, which we are actually currently in the process of staffing. And so it will be a pilot unit that we're going to proceed with to provide veteran services in the institutions. So tier 1, like we talked about before, or I did, are all institutions, and it's regardless of how many veterans are there. The first thing that we're going to do is we have informational visits from VA officials, at least quarterly, and they have the VA's Homeless Veterans Initiative has kind of taken this on, and they will enter not only Bureau of Prisons federal facilities, but they also enter, and some of you I'm sure know this, they'll enter local jails, they'll enter state prisons as well. to look at kind of who the veterans are and how they can best be served. So veterans benefits will apply again in tier one to not only veterans, but it could be family members or dependents. Um, and we track who the veterans are in our population and any dependents who are there. We also have an information sharing system monthly with the Veterans Administration to make sure that we're not missing any veterans. And that system, we send a list of the inmates in bureau custody to the VA, and the VA will send back which of those they can confirm are veterans. An inmate can also self-identify as a veteran, and we'll verify that, and they can be considered as well. So what we're doing here is we're kind of making veterans aware of these are the services that you can get. These are the services from the VA. The VA will come in, they'll talk to the vets, and then it's going to include things like getting treatment for veterans after they release. Once an inmate comes into the Attorney General's custody or the Bureau of Prisons custody, there are responsibility. So we can't send the inmates out to VA facilities like hospitals. Our in-house health services staff provide those, and the Homeless Veterans Initiative specialists, when they come in, cannot provide mental health services for the inmates that are in our custody. It's kind of an all or nothing with us. Once they're in our custody, we have to give them all, and we can't kind of piecemeal that out. So institutions are going to host informational visits from the VA, at least quarterly. It's kind of what we've agreed to. And then inmates in custody, when they are leaving custody, we talked a little bit about the halfway houses or the residential reentry centers. When they transition there, they are still in Bureau of Prisons custody, but we have an agreement with the VA that to assist in reentry, inmates in a halfway house or residential reentry center can access veterans benefits while they're there, so that once they leave our custody entirely, they've already got a bridge and there's a continuity of care there. And they're not dealing with one physician or one mental health provider in the institution, another provider while they're in the halfway house, and yet a third one when they leave the halfway house when they transition back to the VA. So the goal there is to make sure that all of the records follow them. And again, there's a continuity of care. Tier 1 also has, we provide, they can fill out the forms, and I won't go through them. There's like a DD-214 to certify their discharge. They have basically we can do C&P, which is compensation and pension exams, and that prepares them for release. VA staff, or a lot of the VAs, my understanding is they're contracting it out, can at times come into the institutions and complete those examinations while they're in our custody. So again, when they transition into the halfway house and then they re-enter society, they'll already have kind of that bridge there and done, and they can access the benefits when they leave, so that there's not a lag or a gap that's there. So tier 2 services are their outpatient services, and usually they are going to be delivered primarily in group format. And any facility with sentenced inmates that houses more than 25 veterans provides these, and they provide at least one program per quarter with those. As part of it, our education department that we talked about a little bit before can also provide adult continuing education classes. Those would not be therapeutic in nature because it's through our education staff, but those would be training on how to use federal credit unions, financial management, also specific veterans parenting topics, because there's the correlation between incarceration and active duty is separation between families, and kind of re-entering. So that's one of the big parenting topics that we have. Also, GI Bill use is going to be something that we'll look at, and then life challenges that are specific to veterans, and that would kind of border with our psychology services staff, and kind of dealing with mental health issues. So usually these groups that aren't taught by education, they're going to focus on veteran-specific issues, adjustment to incarceration. Again, we talked a little bit about the triggers that are unique to an institutional setting. We also do training, a lot of peer support, look at sleep issues, anger, communication, assertiveness training, um, groups on depression, PTSD, traumatic brain injury. We also look at veteran-specific substance use issues, especially self-medicating is a big topic that we use, and then reentry, reintegration, and then kind of the look at trauma. We also, with our female veterans, look at military sexual trauma. So sexual trauma that's experienced while on active duty in the military is another service that we look at. And Karen will talk a little bit more in a minute about it. Special programs for trauma for men and women, and we have seeking safety and trauma in life for women, and then we have traumatic stress and resilience training and workshops for men. So these are usually facilitated again by our doctoral level psychologists. But again, any inmate veteran, if they have mental health symptoms because of their uniform service, are free to interact with psychology or any other staff because it's kind of the base from which we operate is we provide all inmates those services. So Tiffany has a question, are the self-help resources available produced by the VA or some of the VA produced materials made available to inmates? Primarily they're VA produced materials. So you're going to look at things like the SF-180, which is a request for the military records. You're going to have a certificate of release or discharge as DD-214. And it's kind of a resource library that's there. There's a VA 214193, which is benefits for incarcerated or veterans in a penal institution. Then we talked a little bit about the compensation and pension, which is a 21526. And then there's also the application for review of discharge, which is a DD 293. And that's going to look at an appeal for discharge status for an inmate who's in our custody. So Tiffany is probably more than you ever wanted to know with that question. Okay, so tier of 3, and I will try to stop boring you so much, is our piloted residential unit that we're starting to use now. And again, we're staffing that. It'll be a single institution that we're going to use that pilot in, and then we'll kind of expand that. So when we look at this, we base most of our residential programs and residential programming on what the Bureau calls a modified therapeutic community. So the inmates all live on the unit. It's a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week program. The kind of official programming, staff-led interaction usually takes place for 3 or 4 hours a day. In this case, it'll be 3 hours a day. The other half of the day, the inmates are in educational programming. All inmates who are able to are expected to participate in a job in the institution. So when we talked about institutions like a city, the inmates would work in one of those areas. They might work in facilities to do HVAC things, plumbing, electrical work, anything of that nature. They might work in Unicor, which again was the town factory, for half of the day, and then again the other half they would be in a residential program. So this unit will be led by a master's level clinician, which is different. Usually we have PhDs who are leading these, but that won't be the case here. And what they're going to do is the inmates are in a unit, again in the modified therapeutic community, and the idea is to have them interact with each other, but to also kind of capitalize on the veterans' experience. And if you look at any of the research about these units, the unit is usually more disciplined because the inmates all have the commonality that they went through boot camp in one of the uniformed services. And so we're going to look at more team building exercises that are there, and then kind of your intensive veteran specific program, which is going to be based on need. And in this unit, all of the veterans will not have one need. It's kind of self-based. It's whatever their need is what we can work on. And our residential drug programs, kind of the focus is drug treatment on that unit. The veterans unit's a little bit different because it's kind of it's almost like a choose your own adventure book. They're going to have options. If they're interested in PTSD, we have programming for that, which is a track. If there's healthcare needs, self-care needs, we can look at that. Parenting is another avenue that they'll have. So everyone in the unit has a base from which they are going to operate, and there's a generalist program that we have that's there. And then it's kind of like college. You do your core classes, and then you can take your electives, and you choose those. So this program does not have a set length to it. It's an 18-month program with the inmates, and it's fluid. The inmates there's always inmates coming in, and there's always inmates going out. So there's not necessarily a cohort of inmates that are processing and transitioning through it together. And again, any inmate is eligible to volunteer for that unit, regardless of their discharge status or their status with the VA. So all of the inmates there, again, are going to have institution work requirements, or work assignments rather. So where are there any tier units now? Our pilot is going to be at Victorville, California. And again, we hope to get the pilot online by the end of this year or the end of next, is a question that we just got. So in this, the reason that we put it in Victorville, California is Victorville is a complex, and it has numerous security levels. We can actually use what's called a management variable to flex inmates into institution security levels based on programming need. So if you have it at a medium security, and low security, inmates can participate in that. And there's eligibility criteria to get in. And so they can be submitted for a transfer from any of the 122 facilities to go to the Veterans Unit. So again, that's kind of the sheer size and the depth and breadth of the Bureau is why we would do it with a position or with a policy, with one pilot, and then move over. Sorry, I'm trying to read questions as I talk. And there's another one, will there be positions available for internship placement? We have an internship program in the Bureau, but right now not one in the Veterans Program. And Karen's, you can hear in the background, Karen does that, so I'll get done and she can answer that question better than I can. She got really excited. She got a big smile. Yes, oh, we do. So when we look at the Tier 3 programs and the curriculum that's been established, again, there's a base, and the base is peer support and a peer support group. There's also veterans-based wellness, and again, that is going to capitalize on the inmates' ability individually, but kind of their experience in the uniformed services with PT and using those as kind of group activities together, because one of the big things with military service is teamwork, so it's capitalizing off that. We also, some of the workshops, again, PTSD and TBI, also having a veterans-focused process group and to work through issues with them on the unit and off of the unit while they're there. We talked a little bit about traumatic stress and resilience training. We're also going to provide basic cognitive skills and then criminal thinking modules for them so that we can work on kind of the criminal thinking base and then build with the veteran services on top of that. And then we talked again, navigating the VA. And the other goal at this point that we have written into it is to get kind of volunteer service organizations to come in. Some of our institutions currently have them. And you're looking at things like Disabled Veterans of America, Purple Heart, Wounded Warriors, and AMVETS, so that the vets understand and realize, obviously, that there's other organizations that they can access when they leave. And if they've joined them while they're there, like the American Legion, then they have another support system that they can use when they release and go out into the community. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Karen, and she can answer your internship and psychology questions.
Hi, everyone. Well, I was very excited to see the question about internships. That was actually something I was planning on talking about as well. I know there are many VAs that have internship programs, or staff that are maybe looking for another government job. But we certainly have a lot of positions available. We hire a lot of interns. We still have positions right now that are available. And so I'm actually going to put my contact information. One of the things as Tiffany said at the beginning, is I do recruitment for the Federal Bureau of Prisons for psychologists, and I also provide oversight to all of our 13 um, internship programs. 12 are accredited, 11 are fully accredited, one accredited on contingency, and Victorville, um, which is where the vet unit will be going, is a brand new program, so they will be submitting for accreditation shortly. So, what does a psychologist do in the Bureau of Prisons? Obviously, as Karl talked about, we do offer the Tier 1 to all of our veteran inmates. But we also have other ways that we assess and screen and intervene for inmates who are veterans. So one of the first things that inmates do when they arrive at a Bureau institution is have an initial intake. And within 24 hours, they're screened by health services and unit management team. Inmates who are referred to psychology services as a result of that screening are evaluated promptly by a psychologist. But in general, all of these must be done within 14 days of the inmate's arrival to the institution. So they'll just be seen faster by a psychologist if there's something in the screening that came up. But so some of the things you can see here that we're looking for, history of mental health issues, mental health treatment, a psychosocial assessment, also talking about past employment, emotional, behavioral problems, discussing if they're currently interested in treatment, and if so, what treatment options are available at that institution. And then also talking, I think I didn't mention it, but talking about substance abuse history. So and also trauma history. So one of the things that we do is if we are able to determine here that an inmate is a veteran, we're going to identify what specific services we want to make sure to encourage that individual to engage in. A majority, all of our services are volunteer. We can't force an inmate into treatment. And so we definitely at times use some motivational interviewing to talk with our inmates and encourage them to really think about treatment. But initial intake is just one of the ways that someone might be channeled into our treatment program. Basically, at any point of an incarceration, as Karl said, the prisons really are cities. So you might not see a psychologist regularly because you're doing good when you first move to that city, but then life happens and there's a death in the family, a divorce, you're not getting along well with a cellmate or a work supervisor, sleep issues, any host of issues that may come up, or you were managing your depression, but then as time went on, the strategies that you had utilized aren't working anymore. So an increase in depression, anxiety, things along those lines. So we'll see people at various points of their incarceration. If at any point someone is interested in speaking with psychology services, they just have to put what we call in the bureau a cop out, which is basically just an email to psychology saying, hey, I want to be seen. And so they're put on the schedule. As Karl mentioned, we do have open movement, so they'll be put on the schedule and they'll just walk on over to psychology at their scheduled time to determine, what's going on. Psychology does try to have a active role in and about the institution so that at any time we can, encourage and inmates will see psychology and psychologists as individuals that are looking out for their best well-being, wanting to see them improve, and our staff members that are hopefully seen as individuals that can provide support and help them through whatever any issues are that they're working on. So with that in mind, we do provide quite a few number of services to our inmate population, again, throughout their incarceration. So again, these are all determined based on if a group would be appropriate, individual therapy would be appropriate. Individual therapy is determined on these sort of staffing amount at times. Some of our institutions are shorter staffed, and so they do rely a little bit more on groups when appropriate, but obviously doing individual therapy when that is the best option. But we look at things like the inmate's current diagnosis, their current presentation, their housing assignment, interpersonal skills, things along those lines, to determine what best psychological interventions we do have. So Marissa asked if we have positions for LCSWs, and we do. We absolutely do. We have many of our drug programming and our high security, what's called challenge programming. Oh, I'm sorry, my phone just rang. Ignore. Um, have master's level clinicians that provide substance abuse and criminal thinking services and groups. But then we also have institution and regional social workers that those individuals actually work under health services. But we do have them, so we do have many options, if that makes sense, for social workers in the Bureau. But a couple of the things we do, we have early prevention strategies that when we identify individuals that are that meet whatever that threshold is for the particular program, we definitely put them into a program where we are trying to decrease the likelihood that they'll engage in behaviors that would result in restrictive housing. So one example of that is our BRAVE, what's called our BRAVE program. And we have two of those, one in Victorville, that is a hopping in place out there in California, and one in Beckley, West Virginia. And that's a program where even before an inmate comes to the institutions, they, before they even walk in the door, first time male federal offenders who are young, who meaning 32 years of age and less, are actually put directly into this unit. So they don't even walk into an institution and then we try to get them there. We just put them straight into the unit. That's their very first designation into the Bureau of Prisons. And the idea is to work with inmates that are just arriving, that are meeting those identified risk factors to help them adjust to the prison setting, help them to work through not just how to adjust into prison, but how to also adjust from leaving their families. So these are often, like I said, 32 and younger. They'll have young children at home. So there's conversations about how do you parent from prison. There's criminal thinking groups to address criminal behaviors, anger management, all with the goal of helping them to adjust and have a more stable and productive incarceration, and then also for the bigger picture of the Bureau of Prisons to help to reduce placement in restrictive housing and disturbances at different times. So we also have diversion programs and strategies that we use, and these are alternative approaches to the management of inmate misconduct and other behaviors that may typically lead to restrictive housing placement. So examples where psychology services are involved is the inmate discipline program. So we might work with what's called, again, going back to the community environment, our discipline hearing officer, our DHO, is like the judge who hears the cases. So we'll work with them to identify maybe alternative solutions and consequences of inmate misconduct that are appropriate. And then we also review individuals that are recommended for our ADX unit, which is our maximum security unit. Psychology thoroughly reviews all of those to ensure that we are not placing individuals with serious mental illness in harm's way in these environments. So in addition to that, basic intervention groups, individual therapy. We do have programming for particular units. So in our restrictive housing units, we do have protocols that are self-help protocols developed from the Bureau of Prisons so that they can even do programming and work when their individuals are in restrictive housing unit. We work with unit team a lot to work on transition planning so that as inmates are going out, releasing into society, there's plans in place, particularly for our veteran population. We want to make sure that they are getting connected to all those services that may be available to them and that they have that information. In addition to some of our general groups that we provide, trauma groups, drug groups, anger management, criminal thinking, we also have some specialty programs. And this, you see mental health treatment services, stages, step down, skills, resolves, and fit. Probably doesn't mean anything to you guys, but what that means is our stages is a residential unit focused on what used to be called Access 2 personality disorders, predominantly borderline personality disorder, and we have several. We have several of those programs. Our step-down units are units for individuals with severe mental illness that, for a variety of reasons, have issues being in general population with the other inmates. It could be because of their clinical presentation. It could be because of some of the ways that they go about problem solving, or just even medication management, but they require some more intensive staff services to maintain stability that's separate from a general population. Our skills program is for individuals with cognitive impairments. Resolve is our trauma program. That's in male and female facilities. Initially, it was in female facilities, but we do have some male facilities as well that are providing Resolve programming. And FIT is a female integration unit in our institution in Danbury, Connecticut. And we also provide drug treatment services. This is the largest employer of psychologists in the Bureau. Our drug treatment coordinators and involved in oversight of all of our drug treatment services. We also have sex offender treatment services, residential and non-residential services that we provide for them. So obviously, if an inmate is a veteran, but sex offender treatment would be appropriate for them. We want to make sure that we are meeting the needs of that individual above and beyond what we can do with the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. So we really do look at each person individually to determine what will work best for them. Again, at the end of the day, though, it comes down to that individual has to make the decision. We try to provide all the services that we can, and like I said, through some motivational interviewing, discuss the benefits of engaging in treatment and provide all those services to them. Are there any questions for us? Remember again, there are many positions in the psychology services. So if you are someone you know is interested, are there age restrictions? Yes, there are. So we are a federal law enforcement agency. So we are mandated by law that we must retire at the age of 57. But in order to retire, you have to have 20 years of service. So for those that are quick on math, that means age 37. So we do have a requirement that you have to be 37 or below in order to be hired into the Bureau. However, there are age waivers for up to age 40, and for veterans, that age, from my understanding, doesn't really matter at all. We can sort of look at anyone who's a veteran, even if they're above age. But there are perks. Like I said, we are federal law enforcement, so there's an increase in pay associated with that above and beyond the normal GS of that area, and early retirement. And in order to apply, we are on USA Jobs. We actually have right now several positions open for external hires. We have a mental health unit and sex offender psychologist, so two different positions at our institution at Devens, Massachusetts. We have an advanced care level who's working with our severely mentally ill in Atlanta, Georgia. And we have a commitment and treatment psychologist that works with our sex offender population in Butner, North Carolina. And we have about 40 institutions that are looking to hire a GS11, GS12 entry staff psychologist position into the Bureau. And those positions, you can apply for those all on USA Jobs. And certainly for any that have interns, we can hire interns even though they don't have their degree. We can start looking at hiring up to 9 months prior to the end of their internship year, but usually it's about 6 months before their internship year ends, they're able to apply. So Amanda asked if postdoc positions are available, and does the Bureau assist in helping with licensure? Great questions. So postdoc positions are available. We have only a few of those, though. Devens has some in their sex offender program. They, I think, actually just filled it. And Springfield has a forensic psychologist in Springfield, Missouri, that will be coming. That will be announced in, I think, December is when, to coincide. We don't go through the APIC postdoc match.
Those are really good questions.
It's a USA Jobs process.
Had no idea about
but the BOP does
and
assist in
like
helping
that.
with licensure, including providing funds to purchase
we're
EPP
see if there are any more questions coming through. I'm not seeing any
learning materials
coming through on the chat box. So, Dr. Heigel, Mr. Leukefeld, would it be okay if I start wrapping things up? Or do you have any last words you'd like to share? Any last comments? Well, I want to thank you guys because I've been very VA centric.
Absolutely.
Since my training and my work has all been in the VA, but just kind of learning more about the Bureau of Prisons just in general, let alone the veterans programming, has been really eye-opening for me. So
yeah,
I really
we do appreciate it. We've had a good time
to provide such an informative presentation today. So I know I'm at the top of the hour, so I'm just going to kind of quickly close, talk about some little last-minute logistics. So of course, this is a CE webinar for those of you who are interested in receiving an hour of continuing education credit for participating in the live webinar. You can request this by completing the online evaluation. I have the SurveyMonkey link in the notes pod, but I'll put it here, online evaluation link. It's pretty brief, so it shouldn't take more than a couple minutes to do. But please complete by next Tuesday, October 8th. It typically takes about 2 weeks to get CE certificates to you after that deadline. And also, as a benefit for Division 18 members, CE is free. For non-members who do want to receive CE, you can do so by paying the $15 fee through our PayPal account, and that link is in the note pod as well. And I'll email everyone in a little while, just to remind you of these instructions. And I want to give a quick plug for our next month's webinar that takes place on Thursday, November 7th at 3 p.m. Eastern. So note the new time. We We've been running at 1 p.m. Eastern, but we're switching a little bit later to 3 p.m. And this webinar will be presented by Dr. Lynn Van Male, the National Director of VA Workplace Violence Prevention Program. And the title of her presentation is Workplace Violence Prevention Best Practices in Healthcare, Roles, Responsibilities, and Opportunities for Psychologists. And so I placed an advertisement for this webinar in the files pot that you can download and you can register if you like. So I want to thank everybody for attending today, and again, very much grateful to our speakers. All right, take care, everyone. Bye. Oh, and real quick, thank you, Dr. Norton, for mentioning that many BOP psychologists are members of Division 18. So that's right. All right, take care, everyone. Bye.